It was the winter of 49 BCE. The icy winds swept across the northern Italian plains, carrying with them the smell of wood smoke and tension. In the dim glow of campfires, Roman soldiers tightened their cloaks and glanced toward the south, toward the glittering city of Rome, a place they could enter only at great risk. For centuries, the Roman Republic had been the pride of the Mediterranean world, its governance a delicate balance between the Senate, the people, and its elected magistrates. But now, cracks were forming. Political factions tore at each other like wolves, and personal rivalries threatened to pull the Republic into chaos. At the center of this storm stood one man, Gaius Julius Caesar, a brilliant general, a shrewd politician, and a man whose ambition could not be contained by the ordinary limits of Roman law. Caesar had just completed a spectacular campaign in Gaul, conquering vast territories and amassing a fiercely loyal army. But back in Rome, his enemies plotted to strip him of his command and prosecute him the moment he returned as a private citizen. Roman law was clear. Any general had to disband his army before entering Italy proper. To cross the boundary with troops, the small river known as the Rubicon, was to declare war on the Senate and the Republic itself. It was treason, punishable by death. And so, on a cold January night, Caesar faced the decision that would echo through history. Should he obey the Senate's orders, surrender his power, and face political destruction? Or should he take the ultimate gamble, lead his army across the Rubicon, and plunge Rome into civil war? That night, as the river's dark waters flowed before him, he is said to have uttered the words, "Alia iacta est," the die is cast. This single step, this single decision, would change the course of Roman history forever. It would mark the end of the Republic and the rise of imperial rule. But to truly understand why, we must first go back to the world that shaped Julius Caesar, the enemies who opposed him, and the Republic whose fate hung in the balance. Before Caesar's fateful crossing, Rome was already a city under immense strain. The Republic had expanded far beyond its original city-state boundaries, now ruling over vast territories from Spain to Greece, from North Africa to Asia Minor. This expansion brought wealth, slaves, and glory, but also instability. The Senate, dominated by the conservative Optimates faction, believed in preserving the traditional privileges of the aristocracy. Opposing them were the populares, politicians who sought to use popular assemblies and reforms to gain power, often championing the cause of the common citizens and soldiers. Caesar, with his populist leanings and charismatic connection to the masses, naturally clashed with the Senate's elite. The last decades had already been marked by bloodshed. The rivalry between Marius and Sulla had plunged Rome into civil wars not long before Caesar's rise. Dictatorship, once an emergency measure for crises, had been abused as a tool for personal dominance. Trust between political factions was almost non-existent. In the military sphere, Rome's armies had transformed from citizen soldiers fighting for the Republic to professional forces loyal to their generals. This shift was critical when a soldier's land, pay, and retirement depended on his commander rather than the state. Allegiance could tilt dangerously away from Rome itself. Caesar's legions, hardened by years of campaigning in Gaul, saw him not just as their leader, but as the man who had brought them victory, spoils, and honor. Meanwhile, in the capital, Caesar's alliance with Pompey the Great and Marcus Licinius Crassus, the so-called First Triumvirate, had collapsed. Crassus was dead after a disastrous campaign in Parthia, and Pompey had shifted to the Senate's side, becoming Caesar's most formidable political enemy. By late 50 BCE, the Senate ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. They refused to renew his command or allow him to run for consul while in absentia. For Caesar, this was not just a political defeat, it was a death sentence. His enemies would prosecute him for abuses of power in Gaul, strip him of his fortune, and possibly exile him or worse. Thus, the stage was set. The Republic stood on a knife's edge. One path led to personal ruin for Caesar, and perhaps temporary stability for the Senate. The other path, the one Caesar chose, would ignite a conflict that would consume the Roman world. The night was unnaturally still. The moon hung low over the Italian landscape, its pale light glinting off the narrow ribbon of water that separated Caesar from destiny. The Rubicon was not an imposing river in places, it was little more than a stream. Yet in the eyes of Roman law, it was a sacred boundary. No general could cross it with an army without committing an act of war against the state. Caesar's army was encamped just north of the border, their campfires flickering in the cold January air of 49 BCE. For days, he had debated with his closest officers. Some urged caution, reminding him of the catastrophic consequences of civil war. Others, men who had shared years of victory with him in Gaul, urged boldness, confident in their general's luck and genius. The stakes were stark. If Caesar disbanded his legions and entered Rome unarmed, he would be at the mercy of the Senate's courts and Pompey's political influence. His life's work, his military triumphs, his political reforms, his legacy would be dismantled by his enemies. But if he crossed the Rubicon, he would become an outlaw, a traitor in the eyes of the Republic. According to ancient sources, Caesar wrestled with the decision late into the night. Plutarch recounts that at last, inspired by a sudden surge of resolve, Caesar declared, "Alia iacta est," the die is cast. With those words, he led the 13th Legion across the shallow waters, their boots splashing in the current. That moment was more than a military maneuver. It was a symbolic rejection of the Senate's authority, a public declaration that Caesar would decide Rome's future on his own terms. The sound of those marching feet in the darkness marked the end of the Republic's fragile balance of power. What made this act so extraordinary and so dangerous was that Caesar was not just marching toward battle, he was marching toward civil war, pitting Roman against Roman, legion against legion. Every step toward Rome would mean more than just territory gained. It would mean alliances broken, cities divided, and the political map of the Republic forever altered. By dawn, word of the crossing spread. In villages along the road, citizens watched in stunned silence as the columns of soldiers advanced south. Some cheered, others shut their doors in fear. The Rubicon had been crossed literally and figuratively, and there was no going back. When the Senate received news of Caesar's crossing, panic erupted in the marble heart of Rome. The forum buzzed with rumors. Some claimed Caesar was already at the city gates, others that his forces numbered far more than they truly did. Senators rushed to emergency sessions, their voices echoing under the vaulted ceilings as they debated what to do. For many, this was confirmation of their worst fears, that Caesar's ambition had no bounds, and that he would destroy the Republic to seize supreme power. The conservative Optimates faction pushed for immediate action. They passed the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the final decree granting Pompey and the magistrates extraordinary powers to defend the state. Pompey, though a brilliant general in his own right, was caught off guard. His legions were scattered across the provinces, and the forces in Italy were not ready for a direct confrontation. Rather than risk being trapped in the city, Pompey ordered a strategic withdrawal. Along with many senators and loyalists, he evacuated Rome and retreated south to Brundisium, intending to regroup and call in reinforcements from Spain and the eastern provinces. This retreat was both a tactical move and a political gamble. On one hand, it avoided immediate defeat. On the other, it handed Caesar an incredible propaganda victory. By entering Rome without a fight, Caesar could present himself as the defender of order, stepping into a city abandoned by its leaders. The civilian population was left in a state of confusion. Some feared Pompey's departure meant the city was defenseless against Caesar's wrath. Others welcomed the change, tired of years of political deadlock and eager for the strong leadership Caesar promised. Caesar, ever the strategist, capitalized on the moment. Upon entering Rome, he avoided mass reprisals. Instead, he portrayed himself as a man of restraint, a leader who sought reconciliation rather than vengeance, at least for now. Behind the scenes, however, he moved quickly to secure the city's treasury, ensuring he had the financial resources to fund the coming war. Pompey, meanwhile, prepared for a long campaign. He knew Caesar's real challenge lay ahead, defeating an opponent with vast resources, a powerful navy, and allies across the Mediterranean. The retreat to Brundisium was not a surrender, it was the opening move in a chess game that would determine the fate of Rome. The months following the crossing of the Rubicon plunged the Roman world into chaos. What had once been a unified, if turbulent, republic now fractured into camps loyal to either Julius Caesar or Pompey the Great. The Mediterranean basin, once a symbol of Roman control, became the chessboard for a civil war unlike any before. Caesar's first move was swift and calculated. While Pompey fortified his base in Brundisium and prepared to sail east to gather reinforcements, Caesar marched into Spain to secure the western provinces. This was not mere opportunism. Spain housed some of Pompey's most experienced legions, veterans hardened by years of campaigning. If Caesar could neutralize them before confronting Pompey directly, he would remove a major threat from his rear. In a campaign marked by speed and audacity, Caesar outmaneuvered his opponents in Spain. Through forced marches and clever use of terrain, he trapped Pompey's forces and compelled their surrender without a catastrophic battle. It was a masterclass in psychological and logistical warfare, and it sent a message to all of Rome. Caesar was not just a bold politician, he was a commander of unmatched skill. While Caesar secured the west, the eastern Mediterranean was abuzz with activity. Pompey's allies in Greece, Asia Minor, and the Levant began assembling fleets and armies. The Senate in exile promised that this was a fight for the very soul of the Republic, portraying Caesar as a tyrant in the making. Ports from Athens to Alexandria prepared for the possibility of becoming battlefields. Naval supremacy became a key factor. Pompey, with his experience as the man who once rid the Mediterranean of pirates, knew how to use the sea to his advantage. His fleets could cut Caesar off from supplies, restrict his movements, and threaten Italy's coasts. Caesar, lacking Pompey's naval strength, relied on the speed of his infantry and the loyalty of his commanders to offset this imbalance. Meanwhile, in Rome, the political atmosphere grew tense. Caesar's allies worked to consolidate his control, passing measures to legitimize his actions and punish his opponents. Grain shipments were secured, and public games continued to maintain the appearance of stability. For ordinary Romans, the war was distant for now, but its consequences loomed over every marketplace conversation. By the spring of 48 BCE, the stage was set. Pompey had assembled a massive army in Greece, drawing soldiers from across the provinces. Caesar, having left trusted lieutenants in charge of Italy, crossed the Adriatic with a smaller but fiercely loyal force. It was a dangerous move. Storms and enemy ships threatened the crossing, but Caesar's audacity had become his trademark. The Mediterranean civil war was no longer a matter of skirmishes or positioning. Both sides now prepared for a decisive confrontation that would determine who ruled Rome, and perhaps whether the Republic would survive at all. The morning sun rose over the plains of Pharsalus in northern Greece, casting a golden light on two armies that together represented the might of Rome and the tragedy of civil war. On one side stood Pompey's forces, nearly double Caesar's in number, with a powerful cavalry contingent and the advantage of supply. On the other, Caesar's veterans, outnumbered but confident in their general's leadership and the reforms he had drilled into them over years of campaigning. For weeks, Pompey had avoided a pitched battle, hoping to starve Caesar's smaller army into submission, but political pressure from the Senate in exile pushed him toward a confrontation. Many senators believed that their larger numbers guaranteed victory, and they were eager to return to Rome in triumph. Caesar, recognizing that delay favored Pompey, maneuvered skillfully to force the engagement. On the morning of the battle, his troops formed up in tight, disciplined ranks. He placed his weakest troops in the center, flanked by his battle-hardened legions. Knowing Pompey's cavalry could easily overwhelm his own, Caesar devised a countermeasure. He hid a line of infantry behind his mounted troops, ready to strike at the enemy horsemen when the moment came. The clash began with the thunder of hooves as Pompey's cavalry charged, driving back Caesar's horsemen. But just as Pompey's riders seemed poised to sweep around the flank, Caesar's concealed infantry emerged, thrusting their spears upward in a wall of steel. The shock broke the momentum of Pompey's cavalry, sending them into retreat. With the enemy's flank exposed, Caesar ordered his legions forward. The disciplined advance, combined with relentless pressure, began to crumble Pompey's lines. Despite the numerical disadvantage, Caesar's troops maintained cohesion while Pompey's army fell into disorder. The rout was swift and decisive. Pompey fled the battlefield, abandoning his camp to Caesar's victorious soldiers. The Senate loyalists who had once mocked Caesar's political rise now faced capture or exile. Pharsalus was more than just a battlefield win, it was the turning point of the entire civil war. Caesar had defeated not just an army, but the political legitimacy of the senatorial cause. His victory sent shockwaves throughout the Mediterranean, prompting cities and provinces to switch allegiance. Yet Caesar's triumph was not the end of his struggle. Pompey escaped to Egypt, where he hoped to find refuge with the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII. Caesar, unwilling to leave loose ends, set sail in pursuit, a decision that would entangle him in one of the most dramatic and controversial episodes of his career. When Pompey's defeated army scattered after Pharsalus, the man himself fled across the Mediterranean to Egypt, a kingdom entangled in its own political crisis. The Ptolemaic dynasty, descendants of Alexander the Great's general Ptolemy, ruled Egypt, but its young monarch Ptolemy XIII was locked in a bitter power struggle with his sister and co-ruler, Cleopatra VII. Pompey believed that Egypt, a long-time client state of Rome, would welcome him as an ally. Instead, upon his arrival at the port of Pelusium, he was betrayed. Acting under the influence of Ptolemy's advisors, Egyptian officials assassinated Pompey on the shore, presenting his severed head to Caesar when he arrived days later. It was meant as a gesture of loyalty, but Caesar was horrified. Publicly, he wept for the death of his former son-in-law and rival. Privately, he recognized that Pompey's death robbed him of the chance to appear magnanimous in victory. Still, Caesar understood opportunity when it presented itself, and Egypt's dynastic dispute offered one. Cleopatra, deposed and exiled by her younger brother's faction, saw in Caesar both a path back to power and a means to secure her kingdom's independence under Roman protection. In a bold and famously dramatic act, she smuggled herself into Caesar's presence. Legend claims she was rolled up inside a carpet and pled her case directly. The two formed not just a political alliance, but a personal relationship that scandalized Roman conservatives. Caesar, captivated by Cleopatra's intelligence, charisma, and political acumen, decided to back her claim to the throne. This decision plunged him into Egypt's civil conflict, leading to the siege of Alexandria. The fighting was fierce and chaotic. Streets became battlefields, and Caesar's forces faced not only Ptolemy's troops but also the challenge of navigating the unfamiliar terrain of Egypt's waterways. At one point, a fire during the fighting damaged parts of the Great Library of Alexandria, an irreparable cultural loss that became one of history's most lamented tragedies. Ultimately, Caesar's military discipline and naval reinforcements secured victory. Ptolemy XIII drowned while fleeing across the Nile, and Cleopatra was restored to the throne, ruling jointly with another younger brother. Their political alliance cemented Egypt as a loyal client state, securing Rome's grain supply and strategic position in the eastern Mediterranean. For Cleopatra, it was the beginning of a reign that would make her one of the most famous women in history. For Caesar, it was another bold stroke in his transformation from general to statesman, but also another step away from the ideals of the Republic, as his personal power and influence reached unprecedented heights. With Pompey dead and the eastern provinces pacified, Caesar returned to Rome in triumph. He staged a series of lavish triumphal processions, celebrating victories not only from the Civil War, but also from earlier campaigns in Gaul, Egypt, and Asia Minor. The streets were flooded with spoils of war, exotic animals, and prisoners from far-off lands, a spectacle designed to remind Rome's citizens of his unmatched achievements. Yet beneath the celebrations, the political structure of the Republic lay in ruins. The Senate, already weakened by years of factionalism, now functioned largely as a ceremonial body, ratifying Caesar's decrees. Many senators feared him but also recognized that opposing him could mean exile or death. Caesar introduced sweeping reforms, restructuring the calendar into the Julian system, expanding the Senate with loyal appointees, passing laws to relieve debt, and redistributing land to veterans and the urban poor. These policies were popular with the masses but deeply unsettling to the old aristocracy, who saw their influence slipping away. The most controversial step came when Caesar accepted the title Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. To his supporters, this promised stability after years of chaos. To his enemies, it confirmed their worst fears that Caesar intended to become king in all but name. The Republic had fought to rid itself of monarchy centuries earlier, and the idea of a single man holding such power struck at Rome's political identity. Despite warnings, Caesar dismissed concerns about his growing authority. He attended Senate meetings without the traditional guards, confident in his popularity and in the loyalty of his allies. He began planning ambitious projects, including a campaign against the Parthian Empire that might rival Alexander the Great's conquests. But in the shadows, opposition hardened. A group of senators, some former allies, convinced themselves that the only way to save the Republic was to eliminate Caesar himself. They called themselves the Liberators, claiming to act in defense of Roman freedom. On the Ides of March, 44 BCE, Caesar entered the theater of Pompey for a Senate meeting. There, surrounded by men he considered colleagues, he was attacked and stabbed 23 times. According to legend, his final words, "Et tu, Brute," were directed at his friend Marcus Junius Brutus, whose betrayal symbolized the personal cost of political ambition. Caesar's assassination did not restore the Republic. Instead, it plunged Rome into another cycle of civil wars, culminating in the rise of his adopted heir, Octavian, later Augustus, as the first emperor of Rome. The Republic was gone, replaced by an imperial system that would endure for centuries. Julius Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon, his military brilliance, his political daring, and his controversial accumulation of power had reshaped Roman history forever. Whether he was a savior who brought order to chaos or a tyrant who destroyed the Republic remains one of the most debated questions in history. What is certain is that his actions set Rome on a path from which there was no turning back.